The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Denver International Airport as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked through the terminal with her small rolling suitcase. At 34, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced life and death situations more times than most people could imagine. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, a navy blazer, and comfortable walking shoes. To any casual observer, she looked like just another business traveler heading to her next destination. Sarah had good reason to keep a low profile. After 15 years in the Navy, including 8 years as a SEAL pilot, one of only a handful of women to ever earn that distinction, she was finally taking some well-deserved leave. The past 3 months had been particularly intense, with back-to-back missions in hostile territory that she couldn't discuss with anyone outside her unit. The stress had taken its toll, and her commanding officer had practically ordered her to take 2 weeks off. Her destination was San Francisco, where her sister lived with her family. Sarah hadn't seen her niece and nephew in over a year, and she was looking forward to being just Aunt Sarah for a while. No rank, no life or death decisions, just family time, and maybe some decent sleep. She had deliberately chosen a commercial flight instead of military transport, wanting the anonymity that came with being surrounded by civilians who had no idea what she did for a living. As she approached the gate for United Flight 847, Sarah noticed the usual mix of passengers. Business travelers typed frantically on laptops, families corralled restless children, and a few tourists studied guidebooks about San Francisco attractions. She found a seat near the window and pulled out a paperback novel, something light and mindless that would help her decompress from months of operational stress. The boarding process began smoothly. Sarah was in Group 3 with her economy seat. She had learned long ago that first class attracted too much attention from chatty passengers who wanted to know what she did for work. As she made her way down the aisle of the Boeing 737, she automatically scanned the other passengers, a habit so ingrained from her military training that she couldn't turn it off even on vacation. Most faces were unremarkable: tired business people, excited vacationers, a few college students heading back to school. But 3 men in different parts of the plane caught her attention, though she couldn't immediately put her finger on why. They weren't sitting together, weren't obviously connected, but something about their body language and the way they avoided eye contact with other passengers set off quiet alarm bells in her mind. Sarah dismissed the feeling as occupational paranoia. After years of operating in environments where every stranger could be a potential threat, it was natural for her to be hypervigilant even in civilian settings. She found her seat, 14F, a window seat about halfway back, and settled in for what should have been a routine 2-hour flight. The passenger next to her was an elderly woman named Dorothy, who was visiting her grandchildren in California. Dorothy was chatty but sweet, sharing pictures of her family and talking about her excitement over seeing her newest granddaughter for the first time. Sarah found the conversation oddly comforting. It was exactly the kind of normal, everyday interaction she had been craving after months of military briefings and tactical discussions. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Sarah felt some of the tension leaving her shoulders. The familiar routine of takeoff was soothing: safety demonstration, engine spool up, the gentle acceleration down the runway, and then the moment of liftoff when the world fell away below them. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to truly relax. The first hour of the flight passed peacefully. The flight attendants served drinks, passengers read or dozed, and Dorothy showed Sarah more photos on her phone. Sarah had actually started to get absorbed in her novel when she noticed one of the men she had observed earlier getting up and heading toward the front of the plane. He was Middle Eastern in appearance, perhaps in his 30s, wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt. Nothing obviously suspicious about him, but Sarah found herself watching as he walked past her row. He moved with purpose, not like someone just heading to the bathroom. A few minutes later, she saw another of the men, this one younger, maybe mid-20s, with close-cropped dark hair, also heading forward. The third man, who had been sitting several rows behind her, now stood up as well. Sarah's training kicked in fully as she observed him in her peripheral vision. He was older than the other two, maybe 45, with the kind of wiry build that suggested physical conditioning. Unlike the others, He didn't head toward the front of the plane. Instead, he moved to a position near the middle, where he could observe both the forward and aft sections of the cabin. Sarah's pulse quickened slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm and keep reading her book. She had learned in her SEAL training that premature action based on incomplete information could be more dangerous than taking time to assess a situation properly. There could be innocent explanations for what she was observing. Maybe the men were traveling together but had been assigned separate seats. Maybe they were just stretching their legs or using the restroom. But her instincts, honed by years of high-stakes operations, told her something was wrong. The coordination of their movements was too precise to be coincidental. The way they positioned themselves throughout the cabin suggested tactical thinking. And there was something about their demeanor, a tension that she recognized from her own pre-mission briefings. Dorothy had fallen asleep beside her head resting against the small airplane pillow she had brought from home. Most of the other passengers seemed equally relaxed, reading, watching movies on their devices, or dozing. The flight attendants were going about their normal routines, completely unaware of Sarah's growing concern. Sarah carefully reached for her phone, thinking she might discreetly text someone about her concerns, but then remembered they were at cruising altitude with no cell service. The plane's Wi-Fi system was notoriously slow and unreliable, and besides, who would she contact? Airport security? The FBI? And tell them what exactly? That 3 men had gotten up and walked around the cabin in a way that made her nervous? She was still weighing her options when the first man returned from the front of the plane. But instead of going back to his original seat, he stopped in the aisle near the middle of the cabin, close to where the third man was standing. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized they were now positioned strategically throughout the passenger compartment. One forward, one in the middle, and one toward the back. The second man, who had also gone toward the front, was taking longer to return. Sarah strained to see what might be happening up there, but the cabin's configuration made it impossible to observe the forward galley area from her position. The flight attendants had been moving around normally just a few minutes earlier, but now she couldn't see any of them. That's when she heard it. A muffled sound from the front of the plane that could have been a shout or cry of alarm, quickly cut off. Most passengers didn't seem to notice, probably assuming it was just normal aircraft noise or something from the galley. But Sarah's trained ear recognized it as something else entirely. Her body tensed as every alarm bell in her mind started ringing at once. This was it. This was really happening. Somehow, despite all the security measures and screening procedures, 3 potential hijackers had made it onto a commercial flight. And she was the only person on board who might be equipped to do something about it. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. If this was indeed a hijacking attempt, the men would likely make their move soon. They would want to take control of the flight deck and establish dominance over the passengers before anyone could organize resistance. The fact that they had positioned themselves strategically throughout the cabin suggested they were prepared for the possibility of passenger intervention. She thought about her fellow passengers, Dorothy sleeping peacefully beside her, the young mother with 2 small children 3 rows up, the elderly man across the aisle who was struggling with his crossword puzzle. These were innocent people who had no idea what might be about to unfold. They deserved protection, and, right now, she might be their only hope. But Sarah also knew the dangers of acting too quickly or without sufficient information. If she was wrong about what was happening, any aggressive action on her part could create panic and potentially endanger everyone on board. And if she was right, but moved too soon, she might compromise any chance of stopping whatever the hijackers had planned. The key was to gather more information while staying ready to act. Sarah carefully adjusted her position in her seat, giving herself better visibility of the cabin while appearing to simply be getting more comfortable. She noted the locations of the overhead emergency equipment, the nearest exits, and the positioning of other passengers who might be able to assist if needed. The man in the middle of the cabin, the older one who appeared to be the leader, had taken out what looked like a cell phone and was looking at it intently. But at their current altitude, cell phones wouldn't work unless he was using the plane's Wi-Fi system. More likely, Sarah realized, he was checking some kind of countdown timer or receiving a pre-programmed signal. Her suspicions were confirmed a moment later when the man suddenly looked up and made brief eye contact with the hijacker positioned toward the back of the plane. It was subtle, just a quick nod, but Sarah caught it. They were coordinating, preparing to make their move. Sarah's training had taught her that in situations like this, the first few seconds of action were critical. Hijackers counted on the element of surprise and the natural human tendency to freeze in the face of unexpected violence. If she was going to act, she needed to be ready to move decisively the moment they revealed their intentions. She slowly slipped off her shoes. Heels would be a liability in a physical confrontation, and quietly placed them under the seat in front of her. Dorothy was still sleeping, which was probably for the best. The elderly woman would be safer staying in her seat than getting caught in whatever was about to happen. The captain's voice came over the intercom, making routine announcements about their altitude and expected arrival time in San Francisco. Everything sounded normal from the flight deck, which meant the hijackers hadn't made their move yet. But Sarah knew that could change in an instant. She forced herself to take slow, steady breaths, managing her adrenaline the way as the chaos in the cabin intensified as the three hijackers revealed their intentions. Passengers were screaming, some trying to call loved ones on their phones, others attempting to hide behind their seats as if the thin airplane cushions could provide protection. Children were crying, and Sarah could hear a woman somewhere behind her sobbing uncontrollably. The lead hijacker, the older man who had positioned himself in the middle of the cabin, continued shouting commands. I said sit down. Everyone back in your seats now. He held what appeared to be a crude knife, probably fashioned from metal smuggled aboard in pieces and assembled during the flight. Sarah noted that it was clearly handmade, which explained how it had gotten past security, but also suggested these hijackers were sophisticated and well-prepared. From her position in seat 14F, Sarah could see that the hijacker at the back of the plane also had a weapon, something that glinted in the cabin lighting. The third man, who had gone to the front of the plane, was no longer visible, but she could hear his voice coming from the direction of the galley and flight deck area. That was the most concerning development. If he had taken control of the cockpit, the situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Dorothy grabbed Sarah's arm with a grip surprisingly strong for such an elderly woman. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "Are we going to die?" "No," Sarah said firmly, keeping her voice low but confident. "Stay calm, stay in your seat, and do exactly what they tell you to do. Do you understand me?" Dorothy nodded, tears streaming down her face. Sarah felt a surge of protective anger at seeing the terror in the older woman's eyes. These hijackers weren't just threatening a plane full of strangers. They were terrorizing innocent people like Dorothy, who had been so excited just an hour ago about seeing her grandchildren. The lead hijacker was now walking down the aisle, making eye contact with various passengers as he spoke. "This aircraft is now under the control of the soldiers of the sacred cause," he announced, using what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "We are taking this plane to make a statement that the world cannot ignore. If you cooperate, you will not be harmed. If you resist, you will die." Sarah noticed several things about his demeanor and speech that her training helped her analyze quickly. First, he spoke English with an accent, but was clearly fluent, suggesting education and possibly time spent in Western countries. Second, his movements were controlled and purposeful. He had obviously rehearsed this scenario many times. Third, and most importantly, he seemed confident that he was in complete control of the situation. That confidence could be both an advantage and a disadvantage for Sarah. On one hand, it meant he wasn't expecting resistance from the passengers, so he might be caught off guard by any aggressive action. On the other hand, it suggested he and his companions were well prepared and had planned for various contingencies. A businessman in a suit several rows ahead of Sarah suddenly stood up, his face red with anger. "You can't do this," he shouted. "This is America. You can't just—" He never finished his sentence. The lead hijacker moved with surprising speed, grabbing the man by his tie and pressing the improvised knife to his throat. "I told you to sit down," he said calmly. "You will be my example to the others." Sarah tensed, ready to move if the hijacker actually tried to kill the businessman. But after a few terrifying seconds, he simply shoved the man back into his seat. "Next person who stands up dies," he announced to the cabin. "No more warnings." The businessman slumped in his seat, shaking and holding his throat where the blade had pressed against his skin. Sarah could see a thin line of blood on his collar. The message had been delivered effectively. The hijackers were willing to use violence, and passengers who resisted would face potentially lethal consequences. But Sarah also noted something important about the interaction. The hijacker had chosen to use intimidation rather than actual murder, which suggested he wanted to maintain control without unnecessary bloodshed. That could mean their plan relied on keeping most of the passengers alive, at least until they reached their intended destination. From the front of the plane came the voice of the third hijacker, apparently addressing the flight crew. Sarah couldn't make out his exact words, but his tone was commanding and urgent. A few moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, but something was wrong. His usually calm, professional demeanor was replaced by obvious stress and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he said, his voice tight with tension. We are experiencing an unusual situation aboard the aircraft. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened and follow all instructions from the cabin crew and from our passengers who are now in control of this flight." The admission sent a fresh wave of panic through the cabin. Several passengers began crying openly, and Sarah could hear someone behind her praying in Spanish. The reality of their situation was sinking in for everyone. This wasn't going to be resolved quickly by air marshals or other security personnel. The hijackers had successfully taken control of the aircraft. Sarah's military mind automatically began formulating tactical assessments. The hijackers had clearly planned this operation carefully, but they also had significant vulnerabilities. They were outnumbered roughly 50-3 by passengers, though most civilians wouldn't be effective in a physical confrontation. They were operating in the confined space of an aircraft cabin, which limited their mobility and tactical options. And, most importantly, they didn't know about her background and capabilities. The lead hijacker was now walking toward the back of the plane, checking on his companion and ensuring all passengers in the aft section were complying with his demands. This gave Sarah her first clear opportunity to observe him closely as he passed her row. He was taller than she had initially thought, probably around 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who stayed in good physical condition. His dark hair was cut short, but not military style, and his clothes were casual but neat, designed to blend in during the boarding process. Most significantly, Sarah noted that he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control, but not with the hyper-vigilant awareness of a trained soldier or special operations personnel. As he passed her seat, Sarah forced herself to appear terrified and submissive, keeping her eyes down and her body language non-threatening. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to use her training to neutralize the threat. But the timing wasn't right. She needed more information about their plans and better positioning before making her move. The hijacker at the back of the plane was younger and clearly less experienced than the leader. Sarah could see him from her position, and his nervous energy was obvious. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot and looking around the cabin as if expecting trouble. His weapon appeared to be similar to the leader's, a crude but effective blade fashioned from smuggled components. This one was a potential weak link, Sarah realized. His nervousness could make him either more dangerous, likely to panic and lash out violently, or more vulnerable to a quick, decisive attack. The key would be determining which was more likely and planning accordingly. From the front of the plane, Sarah could hear muffled voices as the third hijacker apparently worked with the flight crew to change the aircraft's course. The steady drone of the engines remained constant, but she had the sense that they were turning, heading away from their original destination of San Francisco. Where were they being taken? Sarah's knowledge of aircraft systems and navigation, gained from her years as a military pilot, told her they had enough fuel to reach several potential destinations from their current position. Major cities on the West Coast, airports in Mexico, even some locations in Canada were theoretically possible depending on how much fuel they had started with and how long they had been in the air. But more concerning was the question of what the hijackers planned to do once they reached their destination. The leader's reference to making a statement that the world cannot ignore suggested this wasn't simply about transportation to a specific location. They were planning something larger, something designed to have maximum impact and media attention. Sarah thought about the September 11th attacks and the horrifying possibility that these hijackers might be planning to use the aircraft itself as a weapon. The Boeing 737 they were on carried enough fuel and had sufficient mass to cause tremendous damage if flown into a building or other target. The thought made her stomach clench with determination. She would not allow these terrorists to turn her fellow passengers into unwilling participants in a mass casualty attack. But she also had to consider the possibility that their plan was different. Maybe they wanted to land somewhere and use the passengers as hostages for political demands. In that scenario, keeping everyone alive would be their priority, at least until they achieved their goals or negotiations broke down. The lead hijacker completed his walk to the back of the plane and began making his way forward again. This time, he stopped at various rows to speak directly to specific passengers. Sarah watched his selection criteria carefully. He seemed to be choosing people who appeared to have authority or resources. Business executives, anyone wearing expensive clothes or jewelry, and older passengers who might have influence or family members willing to pay ransoms. When he reached the row just ahead of Sarah, he stopped to address a woman in her 50s who was traveling alone. "What is your profession?" he asked in that same controlled, conversational tone. I'm a nurse," the woman replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good. You will be useful if anyone is injured during our journey." He moved on without further comment. But Sarah could see the woman was now shaking even more violently, terrified by the implication that injuries were expected. The hijacker continued his census of the passengers, apparently categorizing people by their potential value as hostages or human shields. When he reached Sarah's row, he looked directly at her for the first time. "And you?" he asked. "What do you do?" Sarah had prepared for this moment, knowing that her answer could be crucial to maintaining her cover. "I'm a teacher," she said, allowing her voice to shake slightly with apparent fear. "Elementary school. I'm just visiting my sister." It was partially true. She did have a sister in San Francisco, and she had occasionally thought about teaching after her military career ended. But, more importantly, it was exactly the kind of background that would make her seem harmless and non-threatening to a hijacker. The man nodded dismissively and moved on to Dorothy. "Old woman, what about you?" "I'm retired," Dorothy said with surprising firmness, some of her earlier fear replaced by indignation at his rudeness. "I was a librarian for 43 years. "Useless," the hijacker muttered, but without particular malice. Sarah felt another surge of protective anger on Dorothy's behalf, but forced herself to remain calm and submissive. As the lead hijacker continued his survey, Sarah used the opportunity to conduct her own reconnaissance. She carefully observed the positioning of the other two hijackers, noting their fields of vision and the areas of the cabin they could monitor effectively. She identified potential allies among the passengers, younger men who might be willing and able to assist in a physical confrontation, flight attendants who might have access to emergency equipment, and passengers seated near exits who could help with evacuation if necessary. The aircraft's PA system crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't the captain's voice. One of the hijackers was now speaking directly to the passengers. "We are changing course to our new destination," the voice announced in accented English. "This journey will take approximately 4 hours. You will remain seated with your belts fastened. Food and water will be provided. Anyone who attempts to interfere with our mission will be killed immediately." For hours, Sarah processed this information quickly. That suggested a destination well beyond the West Coast, possibly the East Coast of the United States, Canada, Mexico, or even an international location if they planned to refuel somewhere. The longer flight time actually worked in her favor, giving her more opportunity to plan and execute a response. But it also meant that whatever the hijackers were planning, it was significant enough to justify a complex, long-distance flight plan. This wasn't a simple hostage situation or a demand for ransom money. These men were committed to something larger and more dangerous. The lead hijacker had completed his survey and was now conferring quietly with his companion at the back of the plane. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language suggested they were discussing the next phase of their plan. After a few minutes, The younger hijacker moved to a new position about halfway down the aisle, giving them better coverage of the entire passenger compartment. Sarah realized that the operational phase of the hijacking was transitioning into what military strategists would call the occupation phase. The hijackers had successfully taken control and were now settling in for the long flight to their destination. This meant they would likely become more relaxed and possibly less vigilant as time passed, a potential opportunity for her to exploit. 2 hours into the hijacked flight, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from panic to a tense, fearful quiet. Most passengers had settled into their seats, following the hijackers' demands to remain still and silent. Some stared out the windows, others kept their heads down, and a few appeared to be praying silently. The children on board had finally stopped crying, exhausted by fear and lulled by the steady drone of the engines. Sarah had used this time wisely, conducting what military strategists called continuous reconnaissance. While maintaining her cover as a terrified teacher, she had carefully observed every aspect of the hijackers' operation, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. The most significant development was that the 3 men had settled into a routine. The leader continued to patrol the main aisle, but his movements had become predictable, a slow walk from front to back every 15 to 20 minutes, with brief stops to check on his companions and intimidate any passengers who seemed restless. The younger hijacker remained positioned about halfway back in the cabin, but Sarah had noticed he was becoming increasingly fatigued. His earlier nervous energy was giving way to the kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained high-stress situations. Most importantly, the third hijacker, the one who had taken control of the cockpit area, seemed to be staying forward with the flight crew. Sarah had heard his voice several times over the past 2 hours, apparently giving navigation instructions to the pilots. This meant the forward area of the plane was likely less defended than the passenger cabin, but it also meant any action she took would have to account for his presence near the flight controls. Dorothy had fallen back asleep despite the circumstances, her head resting against the small airplane pillow. Sarah was grateful for this. The elderly woman would be safer unconscious if violence erupted, and her steady breathing actually helped Sarah maintain her own calm appearance. The flight attendants had been pressed into service by the hijackers, distributing water and snacks under close supervision. Sarah had watched these interactions carefully, noting that the crew members were clearly terrified but trying to maintain their professionalism. More importantly, she had observed that they were allowed limited movement throughout the cabin, which could potentially be useful if she needed allies or access to emergency equipment. As one of the flight attendants, a young woman named Jennifer according to her name tag, approached their row with water cups, Sarah made brief eye contact. The woman's face was pale with fear, but her hands were steady as she distributed drinks to passengers. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly when Jennifer handed her a cup, making sure her voice carried the same fearful tone she had been maintaining. But she also managed to convey something else with her eyes, a sense of calm confidence that seemed to surprise the flight attendant. Jennifer paused for just a moment, looking at Sarah more closely. Sarah could see recognition in her expression, not of who Sarah was, but of what she might be. After years of dealing with military personnel on flights, experienced flight attendants often developed an instinct for identifying people with combat training, even in civilian clothes. Sarah gave the slightest nod, so subtle that anyone watching would think she was just acknowledging the water. But Jennifer understood and moved on with what appeared to be slightly renewed confidence. Sarah had just gained a potential ally, someone who could provide information about the hijackers' activities in the forward section of the plane. The tactical situation was becoming clearer in Sarah's mind. The hijackers had made several critical mistakes in their security posture. First, they had become too comfortable, assuming that terrorized civilians posed no threat. Second, they had insufficient communication between their forward and aft positions. The man in the cockpit was essentially operating independently. Third, and most significantly, they had not properly secured the passenger cabin, relying instead on fear and intimidation to maintain control. These weaknesses created opportunities, but Sarah knew she would only get one chance to act. If her first move failed, the hijackers would likely start killing passengers to reassert control. She needed to plan an approach that would neutralize multiple threats quickly and decisively. Her military training had taught her to think in terms of mission priorities. Priority 1 was preventing the hijackers from using the aircraft as a weapon against ground targets. Priority 2 was saving as many passenger lives as possible. Priority 3 was her own survival, which was important only insofar as it enabled her to accomplish the first two objectives. This meant her plan needed to account for the possibility that the hijackers might try to crash the plane rather than lose control of it. She needed to either neutralize all 3 men simultaneously or ensure that the survivors couldn't access the flight controls. Sarah's eyes tracked to the emergency equipment scattered throughout the cabin. Fire extinguishers, first aid kits, and oxygen bottles were all potential weapons in trained hands. The aircraft's configuration also provided advantages. The narrow aisle would limit the hijackers' ability to support each other, and the confined space would favor someone with hand-to-hand combat, training over opponents with improvised knives. The lead hijacker was approaching her section of the cabin on another of his routine patrols. Sarah noticed that he had begun to show signs of fatigue as well. His steps were slightly heavier, and he wasn't scanning the passengers as carefully as he had earlier. The adrenaline rush from the initial takeover was wearing off, replaced by the mental exhaustion that comes from maintaining constant vigilance. When he passed her row this time, Sarah allowed herself a quick glance at his weapon. The improvised knife appeared to be made from sharpened metal, probably pieces of aircraft interior components that had been removed and modified. It was clearly effective. She had seen the cut on the businessman's throat, but it was also crude and would be difficult to use effectively in close combat against a trained opponent. As the hijacker moved toward the back of the plane, Sarah noticed something new. The younger hijacker positioned in the middle of the cabin had sat down in an aisle seat, his weapon resting on his lap. This was a significant tactical error. He had traded mobility and vigilance for comfort, making himself vulnerable to a surprise attack. Sarah began to formulate a specific plan of action. The key would be timing her move to exploit multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. She would need to neutralize the younger hijacker first, since he was closest and most accessible. Then, she would have to move quickly to prevent the leader from reaching either the cockpit or a position where he could threaten other passengers. The biggest unknown was the third hijacker in the forward area. If he heard fighting in the cabin and decided to crash the plane immediately, all her efforts would be meaningless. She needed a way to isolate him from the situation or neutralize him as part of her initial attack. That's when Sarah remembered something from her earlier observation of the cabin layout. The aircraft's galley area, where the third hijacker was positioned, could be accessed from the passenger cabin, but it also had limited visibility of the main aisle. If she could create a distraction that drew his attention without revealing the true nature of her attack, she might be able to gain precious seconds. The solution came to her as she watched Jennifer, the flight attendant, making another supervised round of the cabin. Sarah needed to time her attack to coincide with normal crew activity, using the flight attendant's movements as both cover and distraction. But first, she needed to position herself for action. Sarah had been sitting in the window seat since takeoff, with Dorothy beside her and an empty aisle seat beyond that. She needed to get to that aisle seat without arousing suspicion. "Excuse me," she whispered to Dorothy, gently shaking the elderly woman's shoulder. "I need to use the restroom." Dorothy woke up slowly, confused for a moment before the reality of their situation came back to her. "Is it safe?" she asked quietly. "The hijacker just walked by," Sarah replied. "If I'm going to go, now is the best time." Dorothy nodded and awkwardly shifted in her seat to let Sarah pass. As Sarah stood up, she made sure to appear nervous and uncertain, glancing around as if afraid of attracting the hijacker's attention. This was partially genuine. She was nervous, but about the plan she was about to execute rather than the simple act of moving around the cabin. The younger hijacker in the middle of the cabin looked up when she stood, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "The bathroom," Sarah replied, allowing her voice to shake. "Please, I really need to go." He studied her for a moment, apparently trying to decide if she posed any threat. What he saw was an average-sized woman in casual clothes, clearly terrified, asking for permission to use the restroom. After a few seconds, he jerked his head toward the back of the plane. Make it fast. Anyone else who needs to go can wait. Sarah nodded gratefully and began walking toward the aft restroom, passing directly by the seated hijacker. This gave her a perfect opportunity to observe his exact position, the way he held his weapon, and his current level of alertness. More importantly, it allowed her to note the location of other passengers who might be at risk during her attack. The businessman who had been cut earlier was still in his seat several rows ahead, no longer showing signs of his earlier defiance. Behind the seated hijacker were a young couple holding hands tightly, and an older man reading what appeared to be a religious text. All potential casualties if the situation went wrong. As Sarah passed the hijacker's position, she stumbled slightly, catching herself on the arm of a nearby seat. "Sorry," she mumbled, appearing clumsy with fear. What she was actually doing was confirming the exact distance between his position and the emergency fire extinguisher mounted on the wall 2 rows back. The restroom was tiny, as airplane bathrooms always were, but it gave Sarah a few precious minutes to finalize her plan and prepare mentally for what was about to happen. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw the face of a woman about to commit herself to a course of action that would either save everyone on the plane or get a lot of people killed. But that was the nature of command decisions in life-or-death situations. Perfect information was never available, and waiting for better circumstances usually meant losing the opportunity to act altogether. Sarah had made similar decisions in hostile territory overseas, and while the stakes had never been higher, the process was familiar. She thought briefly about her team back at base, wondering if they would approve of her plan. Then, she thought about Dorothy's excitement over seeing her grandchildren and the young mother with 2 small children who was sitting near the front of the plane. These people deserved to live, and right now she was the only person who could ensure that happened. Sarah splashed some water on her face and took several deep breaths, managing her adrenaline and preparing her body for explosive action. Her hands were steady, a good sign. Her mind was clear and focused. She was as ready as she could be. When she exited the restroom, Sarah walked slowly back toward her seat, again playing the role of a frightened passenger. The lead hijacker was near the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with someone, probably the third man who was controlling the cockpit area. The younger hijacker was still seated in the aisle, though he appeared to be more alert now, possibly because his leader had instructed him to be more careful. As Sarah approached her row, she made eye contact with Jennifer, the flight attendant, who was cleaning up empty cups near the galley. Sarah needed a distraction that would draw the attention of the hijacker in the cockpit area without alerting the 2 men in the passenger cabin. The Las Vegas airport had been transformed into a secure staging area by the time Flight 847 came to a stop at a remote gate. Sarah could see through the small window that the aircraft was surrounded by FBI vehicles, SWAT teams, ambulances, and what appeared to be officials from multiple federal agencies. The normally busy airport had been partially shut down to accommodate the emergency response. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the familiar voice over the intercom, though now it carried relief instead of the fear that had characterized his earlier announcements. "We have landed safely in Las Vegas, Nevada. Please remain in your seats while federal agents board the aircraft to secure the scene and begin processing what happened today." Sarah looked around the cabin at her fellow passengers. The shock was beginning to wear off for most of them, replaced by a mixture of gratitude, exhaustion, and the kind of emotional numbness that follows traumatic events. Some people were crying quietly, others were on their phones trying to call family members, and a few were staring blankly ahead as their minds struggled to process what they had experienced. Dorothy was still holding Sarah's hand, apparently reluctant to let go of the person who had saved her life. "Will they want to talk to me?" she asked quietly. "I don't know what I could tell them that would be helpful." "They'll want to interview everyone," Sarah replied gently. "It's standard procedure after something like this. Just tell them exactly what you saw and heard. Don't worry about whether you think it's important. Let them decide that." The elderly woman nodded, though Sarah could see she was nervous about the prospect of being questioned by federal agents. It was understandable. Most civilians had no experience with law enforcement interviews, especially in the context of a terrorism investigation. The aircraft door opened, and the first wave of FBI agents boarded. Sarah wasn't surprised to see that they were heavily armed and wearing tactical gear. From their perspective, they were entering a potentially dangerous situation with unknown variables. The fact that someone had claimed to neutralize the hijackers didn't mean there weren't additional threats on board. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and the kind of calm, professional demeanor that Sarah recognized from her own military experience. She surveyed the cabin quickly, taking in the positions of the restrained hijackers and the general state of the passengers. "I'm Special Agent Patricia Wells, FBI," she announced to the cabin. "The immediate danger is over, but we need everyone to remain seated while we process the scene. We'll be interviewing each of you individually over the next several hours to understand exactly what happened here." Her eyes found Sarah and held her gaze for a moment. Sarah could see the agent making mental notes about her appearance, demeanor, and positioning in the cabin. Someone had clearly briefed Agent Wells about Sarah's role in stopping the hijacking, and she was already categorizing her as a key witness rather than just another passenger. "Ma'am," Agent Wells said, addressing Sarah directly, "I understand you were instrumental in resolving this situation. We're going to need to speak with you first and in detail. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied. "But you should check on the other passengers. Some of them have been through a lot today." Agent Wells nodded and began directing her team to tend to the other passengers while crime scene technicians started documenting the positions of evidence throughout the cabin. Sarah watched the professional efficiency of the federal response and felt a familiar sense of respect for law enforcement personnel doing their jobs under difficult circumstances. But she also knew this was just the beginning of what would likely be a very long process. There would be investigations into how the hijackers had gotten weapons on board, questions about their connections to larger terrorist organizations, and extensive debriefings about every aspect of the flight from takeoff to landing. After about 30 minutes, Agent Wells returned to Sarah's row. "We're ready for you now. We've set up an interview room in the airport terminal where we can talk privately." Sarah stood up slowly, her muscles stiff from the tension and adrenaline of the past few hours. As she prepared to leave the aircraft, several passengers spoke up to thank her. The businessman who had been cut by the hijacker shook her hand warmly. The young mother with 2 children was crying as she tried to express her gratitude. Even some passengers she hadn't directly interacted with wanted to acknowledge what she had done. "You're a hero," one elderly man said simply. "Thank you for saving us." Sarah accepted their thanks graciously, but she was uncomfortable with the label of hero. In her experience, heroes were people who sacrificed their lives for others. She had simply done what her training and conscience demanded when faced with an impossible situation. Dorothy was the last to say goodbye. "Will I see you again?" she asked, still seeming reluctant to let Sarah leave. "I hope so," Sarah replied honestly. "You have my contact information if you ever want to talk about what happened, or if you just want to show me pictures of your grandchildren." The elderly woman smiled through her tears. "I'd like that very much." The interview room at the Las Vegas airport was sterile and windowless, designed for security rather than comfort. Agent Wells was joined by 2 other FBI agents, a representative from Homeland Security and someone from the Transportation Security Administration who was taking notes on potential security failures. "Before we begin," Agent Wells said, "I need to verify your identity and get some basic information about your background." Sarah provided her military ID, social security number, and contact information for her commanding officer. She watched as Agent Wells made notes and communicated with someone via secure radio, presumably running background checks and confirming her naval service record. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Navy SEALs," Agent Wells said after a few minutes. 15 years of service, currently on leave. Multiple combat deployments, numerous commendations for valor, and specialized training in counterterrorism operations. The other agents in the room visibly relaxed as Sarah's credentials were confirmed. She had gone from being a potential suspect to being a credible witness with relevant expertise. "Now," Agent Wells continued, "I want you to walk me through everything that happened from the moment you boarded that aircraft until we landed here in Las Vegas. Don't leave out any details, even if they seem insignificant." Sarah spent the next 2 hours providing a comprehensive debrief of the hijacking. She described her initial suspicions about the 3 men, their coordination during the takeover, their apparent objectives, and the tactical decisions she had made during her counterattack. The agents asked detailed questions about the hijackers' weapons, their apparent level of training, and any conversations she had overheard that might provide clues about their organization or motivation. Based on your military experience, Agent Wells asked, how would you assess the sophistication of this operation? Sarah considered the question carefully. They were well prepared in some ways. The coordination, the improvised weapons that got past security, the knowledge of aircraft systems needed to change course. But they also made significant tactical errors. They became complacent after taking control. They didn't properly secure the passenger cabin, and they allowed emotion to override operational judgment during the crisis. What's your assessment of their ultimate objective? Based on their intended destination of Washington, D.C., and their apparent willingness to kill passengers, I believe they were planning to use the aircraft as a weapon against a ground target. This wasn't a hostage situation or a transportation hijacking. It was a planned suicide attack. The gravity of that assessment settled over the room. Everyone present understood that Sarah's intervention had likely prevented not just the deaths of everyone on Flight 847, but potentially hundreds of additional casualties on the ground in the nation's capital. Agent Wells made extensive notes, then looked up at Sarah again. We're going to need you to stay in Las Vegas for at least another 24 hours while we complete our initial investigation. After that, you'll likely be called to testify before a federal grand jury and possibly in criminal proceedings. Sarah nodded. She had expected as much. High-profile terrorism cases involved extensive legal processes, and her role as the primary person who had stopped the attack made her testimony crucial. There's one more thing, Agent Wells said. The media has gotten word of what happened, and they're very interested in talking to you. We can't prevent them from trying to contact you, but we'd appreciate it if you coordinated any public statements with our press office. The investigation is ongoing, and there are details we can't have disclosed publicly yet. This was the part Sarah had been dreading. Military personnel were trained to avoid media attention, especially regarding classified operations or ongoing investigations. But civilian law enforcement operated under different rules, and public interest in a prevented terrorist attack would be intense. I understand, Sarah said. I'll refer all media requests to your office. After the interview concluded, Sarah was escorted to a hotel near the airport where the FBI had arranged for her to stay while the investigation continued. As she sat in the generic hotel room, she finally had a moment to process what had happened and what it meant for her future. Her phone had been buzzing with messages since they landed, calls from her commanding officer, her sister in San Francisco who had seen news reports about the hijacking, and several numbers she didn't recognize, which were probably reporters trying to get her to comment on the story. The first call she returned was to her sister. Sarah, thank God you're okay. Her sister's voice was filled with relief and concern. I saw on the news that there was a hijacked plane from Denver, but they didn't release passenger names. When I couldn't reach you, I thought, I'm fine, Lisa, Sarah said. But I'm going to be stuck in Las Vegas for a few days dealing with FBI interviews and legal stuff. Can you reschedule our plans for next week? Of course. But, Sarah, the news is saying someone on the plane fought the hijackers and saved everyone. That was you, wasn't it? Sarah was quiet for a moment. I can't really talk about the details while the investigation is ongoing. That means it was you. Lisa's voice was filled with pride and worry in equal measure. My little sister, the hero. After ending the call with her sister, Sarah looked out the hotel window at the Las Vegas skyline. Tomorrow, she would probably have to deal with reporters, more FBI interviews, and the beginning of what would likely be a long legal process. Eventually, she would return to her naval duties and her team of fellow SEALs. But tonight, she was just grateful that Dorothy would get to see her grandchildren, that the young mother on the plane would get home safely to her family, and that whatever target the hijackers had been planning to attack in Washington would remain standing. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most important victories were the ones that prevented tragedies rather than creating headlines. The families of everyone who had been on Flight 847 would get to go home, and that was worth all the complications and attention that would follow. As she prepared for bed in the anonymous hotel room, Sarah thought about her SEAL training and the oath she had taken to protect and defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Today, She had fulfilled that oath in a way she never could have anticipated when she first put on the uniform. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, everyone was safe. That was enough. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. As Sarah passed Jennifer, she accidentally bumped into her, causing the flight attendant to drop several plastic cups. The noise wasn't dramatic, but it was the kind of ordinary sound that would naturally draw attention from the forward area. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said loudly enough to be heard throughout the cabin, bending down to help pick up the cups. What she was really doing was positioning herself perfectly for her attack. The third hijacker's voice could be heard from the galley, asking what had happened. Jennifer called back that it was just a clumsy passenger, nothing to worry about. But Sarah knew he would likely come out to investigate anyway. It was what any security-conscious person would do. As she helped Jennifer with the cups, Sarah palmed one of the heavier PLA stick items and straightened up just as the seated hijacker was turning his attention back to scanning the cabin. She was now standing in the aisle about 6 feet behind him, with clear access to the fire extinguisher on the wall. The forward hijacker appeared at the front of the cabin, looking back to see what had caused the commotion. Perfect. All 3 men were now positioned exactly where Sarah needed them to be. This was it. Sarah took one last look at Dorothy, who was watching her with worried eyes, and at the other passengers who had no idea their lives were about to change forever. Then, she moved. But it also meant that the window for preventing whatever they had planned at their destination was getting smaller. Once they landed and achieved their objectives, it would likely be too late to save the lives that might be lost in whatever attack or statement they were planning to make. Sarah closed her eyes briefly and thought about her SEAL training, specifically the lessons about operating alone behind enemy lines. Her instructors had always emphasized that the most dangerous missions were often the ones where you had no backup, no extraction plan, and no way to call for help. This was exactly that kind of situation. But they had also taught her that individual operators could sometimes achieve things that entire teams couldn't, precisely because they were unexpected and could act without coordination or planning delays. Right now, she was the only person on the aircraft with the training and experience to stop what was happening. The question was how to use that advantage effectively while minimizing risk to the innocent people around her. Sarah opened her eyes and began to plan. He had been taught in countless training exercises. Her body needed to be relaxed and ready to move, not locked up with tension. She thought about her team back at base, her fellow SEALs who had trained with her and trusted her in life and death situations. They weren't here to back her up this time, but the skills they had helped her develop were. The moment came suddenly, without warning. The older man in the middle of the cabin stood up and shouted something in a language Sarah didn't recognize, but the intent was unmistakable. At the same time, she heard shouting from the front of the plane, the second hijacker revealing himself. The third man, toward the back, also stood up, and Sarah could see something metallic in his hand. Passengers began to scream and panic, some trying to get out of their seats, others pressing themselves down as if they could somehow become invisible. Dorothy woke up with a start, confused and frightened by the sudden chaos around her. "Stay down," Sarah whispered urgently to the elderly woman. "Whatever happens, stay in your seat and keep your head down." The lead hijacker was now shouting commands in English, his voice carrying over the panicked voices of the passengers. "Everyone sit down. Sit down now, or we start killing people. This plane is under our control." Sarah remained in her seat, but every muscle in her body was coiled and ready. She was outnumbered 3-1, had no weapons, and was surrounded by innocent civilians who could become casualties in any confrontation. But she also had advantages the hijackers didn't know about: 15 years of elite military training, combat experience, and the element of surprise that came from looking like just another passenger. The question was no longer whether to act, but when and how. Sarah knew that the lives of everyone on board now depended on the decisions she made in the next few critical minutes.